We're going to look at the outbreak of war and what was happening in Ireland in 1914. Then we're going to look at the Irish soldier in the British Army, which is a story, of course, in Ireland that has largely been forgotten. But in the last 20 years, there's been huge effort to change that. And since about half of our population are under 25, it's a story they've grown up with. My own generation would not have learned about it in school, but it has been quite a contentious story up to the 1990s. Then we're going to look at Irish soldiers in other armies, because it's not just the British Army. The Irish serve in the Canadian Army in large numbers, in the Australian Army, and also later on in 1917 in the American Army. And there's new research on that coming out every year. It's a new exciting area of research for PhDs. And then we're going to look at commemorating World War I in Ireland and some of the issues that have occurred over the last couple of years. And more importantly, what we're actually doing now for the period 1912 to 22. We call it the decade of commemorations in Ireland. So due to our history with the 1916 Rising War of Independence and our Civil War and World War I, there's almost an anniversary every single day for 10 years in Ireland, which is good for me because it means I have a job for 10 years. So this is a recruiting map for the Irish regiments in the British Army. 200,000 Irishmen volunteered over 5 years, of which about 35,000 were killed. If I bring 5 academics into the room, they'll all argue about those figures. But I'm suggesting that those are the figures. They could be higher, they could be lower. They all volunteered. Conscription was never introduced into Ireland. And the real peak for recruitment is right up until 1917. And then the impact of 1916 Rising, but also the harsh reality of the large casualties occurring after the Somme, I think, and in Passchendaele also impacts on recruiting in Ireland. And there were 14 Irish regiments in the British Army in 1914, and they were to provide over 72 battalions to the British Army during the war. You can see in the map the areas that they recruited in. There were also 3 separate divisions, the 10th, the 16th, and the 36th, the famous Ulster Division, and they all fought in the war. And we'll be talking about those. You'll note in the piece about the lecture, I'm going to be very much focusing on 1915 and the role of the 10th Division. And this is a blow-up of the map just showing the various areas where the regiments recruited. In the west, you have the Connaught Rangers, covering the west of Ireland, Galway, Roscommon, Leitrim, Sligo, and Mayo, which are very large counties. And then the Royal Munster Fusiliers going from Cork as far as Tralee. Again, mainly recruiting in the towns of Tralee, Cork and Limerick, but also sometimes in the countryside. There's always low recruitment in Ireland from the countryside, from the labouring class. It's mainly from the towns that you're actually going to see large recruits happening. And as you get in around Dublin, you have the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who provide 11 battalions, the Royal Irish Regiment, which are based down in the south, and then in Northern Ireland you have the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and then the Royal Irish Rifles. So in 1914, what was happening in Ireland? There was a Home Rule crisis between 1912 and 1914. Many Irish nationalists were looking for independence through Home Rule. It had kind of got bogged down in Parliament over the previous 30 years. Volunteer armies were created. The Irish Volunteers and the Ulster Volunteer Force were created in 1913. And by 1914, you're looking at 30,000 men in uniform in these kind of paramilitary or militia type units. A split occurs in August 1914 among the Irish Volunteers over what is going to happen now that the war has broken out. And the Home Rule Act is suspended. Everyone thinks this war is going to be over by Christmas. Of course, it's not going to be over until 1919, and many things have happened by 1918. John Redmond takes the majority of the members of the Irish Volunteers and creates the National Volunteers. John Redmond is kind of largely forgotten in Irish history now, but he was the key politician of Irish nationalism in 1914 in the mould of Parnell and O'Connell. But he's now largely forgotten because of the decisions that he made in 1914 encouraging men to join up into the British Army. A small minority of that group of Irish volunteers, about 11,000 of them, remain as the Irish Volunteers, and those are the volunteers that are going to be involved in the 1916 Rising. But the majority follow John Redmond and join up into the British Army. And this is what would have been printed in September and August of 1914. Very specific World War I recruiting posters printed in Dublin, very much geared towards encouraging Irish men to join up. And there's about 300 of these posters made between 1914 and 1916. We have a very sizable collection ourselves, but then the Trinity College actually has a wonderful collection on their website, which you can actually go through every single one. So very much either it's bishops from the Roman Catholic Church or politicians from Irish nationalism encouraging recruits to join up. Also focusing on the Irish regiments, there's the encouragement with the pals to join up with your friends, go to an Irish regiment before things change, and then you're just going to be thrown into any old regiment. So that's the main focus at this time. And the Irish themselves, where do they fight? They fight everywhere. They fight the Western Front. They fight from 1917 in northern Italy. The 10th Division are fight in Gallipoli and later on in Salonika, and fight in the Bulgarian War when Bulgaria joins, a largely forgotten battle, but the 10th spend almost 2 years there. And then you find the Connaught Rangers, many of the Connaught Rangers in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, fighting, and the disastrous campaigns of Townsend down that way, and later on in Palestine. So they really are in every part of the war of World War I. Just to focus on one of those, I'm not going to go through all 14 regiments, but just to focus on the Royal Jumping Fusiliers, they provide 11 battalions during the war. The 1st Battalion, 6th and 7th Royal Jumping Fusiliers all fight in Gallipoli in 1915. The 2nd are the 1st Battalion to go into battle in August 1914 as part of the 4th Division. The 8th and 9th are part of the 16th Division, which goes to France in December 1915, but really doesn't get involved in heavy fighting until the second part of the Battle of the Somme in Ginchy in September. The 10th arrived in France in August 1916. They're actually involved, which I'll talk about later on, in suppressing the 1916 rising. And then the 3rd, 4th and 5th Reserve Battalions really stay in the British Isles and don't move beyond serving in those countries as home defence units. The 11th Royal Dublin Fusiliers were the last unit to be created in July 1916. And by January 1918 it was located in Aldershot. What happened with that unit, they were used to fill in the gaps in the other units, and eventually the 8th and 9th are actually disbanded and their men are moved down into the 1st and 2nd battalions. That kind of shows the problem of recruiting once the rising occurs. And then if you look at the figures, quite stark, 4,777 soldiers died during World War I. And out of that, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers were based in Dublin, very much a cosmopolitan town, and 28% of the Dublin Fusiliers who were killed were not Irish, which kind of represents what the city was. It was very much a unionist city at the time, with a mix of people, a lot of Scots joining up into Irish regiments as well as Welsh. So, just to move down south to the Royal Munster Fusiliers, one of the donations that we recently received from the museum was a photographic album taken by photographs of the Royal Munster Fusiliers in Burma in 1912. The Lieutenant Colonel decided to have every single section of the battalion photographed. We've colorised some of the photographs just to show you what the Munster Fusiliers would have looked like on the parade ground in Rangoon. The Munsters are interesting because they're the furthest of any Irish regiment. They're the furthest to come back to England for the war. And when they come back in 1914, they're then sent off to fight in the first battles of Gallipoli and suffer very, very large numbers of deaths. But as I said, the Lieutenant Colonel has decided to have every section of the battalion photographed. And it's amazing, he's also filled in all the details. We have the list of names on this. And as I say, with the first battle that they do take part in Gallipoli, over 65% of the people in the photographic album are dead by the end of their first day of battle, including the hockey team. Everyone got photographed. The 2nd Royal Munster Fusiliers were back in England, in Aldershot. They're sent off to fight very, very quickly in August of 1914. Their big battle that they fight is the Battle of Atru, largely forgotten nowadays in Ireland, but more and more people are learning about it in the retreat from Mons. They're surrounded at Atru, which is a small little village based on a crossroads of a railway, typical kind of French town, a railway and a canal, so an ideal place for them to settle on. But they were surrounded by about 5,000 angry Germans at that stage who were chasing them, including a large amount of artillery. As I said, they had been the year before in England, had been serving in England, and that would have been a tradition with the Irish regiments. One battalion is home service, the other battalion was going to be somewhere in the British Empire, normally in India. This is a book from 1915, which kind of was published by the families of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, detailing what had happened to the battalion in the first year and a half of war. And it details what happens to the Munster Fusiliers just outside of True. True is down here with the railway and with the canals. And they're surrounded around a orchard, and they hold out for 12 hours. But the casualty rates are quite high. 130 are killed, 155 escaped, and then 250 surrendered at that stage. So a very short war for many of these men. They would have only seen about 3 weeks of fighting before they were surrendered and spent the rest of the war in prisoner war camps. What's interesting about the graveyard that you see here is that the Munster Fusiliers after the war, because it was so early in the war, were able to recover all the bodies and put them into this grave, which they built themselves and paid for. So in one case you'll find one graveyard with 99 Irishmen lying there, which is very unusual because as the war takes hold, the numbers and scale of war are quite colossal. They're very concentrated on specific lines of the front lines. Here is a very small battle, and as I say, it's quite a moving graveyard which I visited last year and is quite regularly visited by the Royal Munster Fusiliers Association. One of the Munsters was William Foley, and he became captive for years. This is a photograph of him as a prisoner of war. He was 33 years old, and as I said, he was captured and his war was over. And especially by 1918, kind of became very tough for prisoners of war. With poor diet, Germany didn't have the food to provide for them, and became very, very tough for them. But a very short war for him, and it's quite a common story. Later on, he serves in the British Army, or in the Irish Army, and retires from that as a Sergeant Major. Major Egan is the Royal Army Medical Corps. Traditionally in Ireland, the medical schools in Ireland, there will be 5 of them, have provided since the 19th century large numbers of graduates to the Royal Army Medical Corps. Major Egan was a Roman Catholic from County Waterford. He joined just before the war to become a doctor, and this is quite common, as I say. Out of his class in UCC, which is University College Cork, 80% of the class actually would have joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was captured very early on, again at Mons, and this is a photograph of him having a drink of beer with his opposite number, the doctor in charge of the camp, or the medical facilities at the camp, and then you have his prison wardens behind him. But he was released in a prisoner exchange in 1915, again, as a doctor exchanges do occur, not for the Fusilier Foley in our previous slide. What's interesting about Egan is released in the summer of 1915, and straight away after 2 weeks leave with his family is sent to Gallipoli, and he serves there through the next 6 months in that campaign. Then once the evacuation of Gallipoli occurs, he's given another 2 weeks with his family before getting ready for the big Battle of the Somme for the summer of 1916, and he remains on the Western Front, later on going up to Ypres and serving throughout Passchendaele. And at the end of the war, he's moved back to India, and he's just there in time for the Third Afghan War, which is the war between Afghanistan and India. So I'm not saying this is a normal story of an Irishman in World War I, but we use it to tell our visitors that the story isn't all based around the 200 miles along the Western Front. People do move around, and Major Egan is probably an exception, but he did travel. We also have the London Irish Rifles, and we have objects on display in our exhibitions relating to London Irish, in particular to Ralph Sutherland. And this is a problem when you come to defining how many Irishmen served in World War I, because you have large emigration occurring from Ireland. Between the famine in 1850 to 1914, 1.4 million people alone go to America. Another million probably come to England. So it's trying to go through records to actually find out second and third generation Irish people joining up into the British Army. Ralph Sutherland is one of those, and he's involved with the London Irish Rifles at the assault at Lewes, which is when they famously kicked a football across no man's land. But he dies at a very, very young age. Another soldier from this time from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers was a veteran of the South African War, was minding his own business in Dublin, and as a reservist though was called up, and again becomes a prisoner of war in 1914. That's Private Dowling. But his family had served for 2 generations in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he was actually born in India, and had spent a large part of his childhood in Malta before joining the Royal Dublin Fusiliers as a young man to fight in the Boer War, and then of course being captured. In many ways he was lucky that he was captured in 1914. There is a big effort in Ireland for women to become VADs, but also become nurses. Eleanor and Poppy Burrows become nurses in 1915 and go out, and again, a bit like the Munster Fusiliers photographic album, spend a huge amount of time taking photographs. They're only about 15 miles behind the front lines, and this is the 2 sisters here. But they have an amazing collection of photographs and letters from soldiers to them, thanking them for the care that they received during their stay with them. Again, we have colorized a lot of our photographs that we have copyright, just again for a younger audience to make them realize what is behind a black and white photograph. I'd love black and white, but I find my own kids nowadays live in a world of iPads and bright colors and don't engage with black and white photographs as well as my own generation would. So we cover the soldiers, but we also cover the landed gentry. Lieutenant Nugent was a grandson of the Earl of Westmeath, who owned most of the county, and had lived in wealth and privilege. Traditionally, the family had served in the Scots Guards, and he was killed just before Christmas on the 18th of December 1914. And when you read the records for the Scottish Guards, one of the reasons why they participated in the Christmas truce was to find out what actually had happened to Nugent and a number of officers and try and recover their bodies. That was one of the reasons why they were involved in the truce. And we have these prominent mementos of John Grumley, who was from the Connaught Rangers. When these arrived in the front line, he'd already been killed while he was serving with the 2nd Connaught Rangers. And they were then posted back to his family. So we have the box, but also the original cigarettes, which were never used, of course, because poor John had passed away. When we come back to look at Ireland, what's happening in Ireland, Belgian refugees are coming to England, of course, but 3,000 of them make further trips to come into Ireland, mainly going to live in places like Monaghan and Cavan and get involved in industries there. Many of them are still there today. And also in Tipperary, Richmond Barracks, which was the home of the Royal Munster Fusiliers were based there for a long time, was turned into a prisoner of war camp for German soldiers. So almost 3,000 soldiers was based there. In late 1915, Dublin Castle decided maybe having 3,000 bored Germans in the centre of Ireland was not a good thing, and they were sent off to Canada, which is probably a smart move on Dublin Castle's. One of the few things that Dublin Castle did right during the Rising. Munitions factories are opened in Ireland. Again, because there isn't conscription in Ireland, only about 3,500 women work in these factories. There are still enough men around to be involved in industry in Dublin. Florence Lee is one of those, and she works in Dublin making mainly 18-pounder shells, not too far from the National Museum is today. And this is an amazing collection of photographs on the Imperial War Museum websites, just photographs from this particular factory. And as you can see on the back wall, the man in the trenches wants shells. He wants an Irish shell, apparently. So, but an amazing little collection of photographs. So moving into 1915, the Irish are heavily involved with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and the Royal Munster Fusiliers on V Beach, which we'll talk about, and the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers. So these are all full-time units which are then sent into battle. For the Munster Fusiliers and Dublin Fusiliers, they land on V Beach, just here. And within a 12-hour period, you can see the quite large casualty rates that they receive. 300 men left from 900 men for the Royal Munster Fusiliers. And the Dublin Fusiliers got fairly hammered. This is the boat that they were on, the River Clyde. They were also on barges on either side of the boat. The Turkish positions, they were heavily dug in. They were well equipped. They had pom-pom artillery guns, small artillery guns, firing 3-pound shells and machine guns. And the idea was that the boat would come and be beached on the V Beach, and simply the troops would throw themselves off and run up and defeat the Turkish positions. But sadly for the Munster Fusiliers and the Dublin Fusiliers, that was not to happen. And this is what the Irish actually were attacking, which is an old Ottoman fort which had been reinforced. And you can see here the barge, one of the barges. This is taken from the River Clyde, and it's again part of the collection of the Imperial War Museum. What I find interesting about this photograph, though, is if you look here, you can actually see the soldiers and they're hiding or in cover from the machine guns that are coming in from the Turks. Well, sadly for a large number of the Munster Fusiliers here, they have been killed already. Both units are amalgamated and they become known as the Dubsters. They amalgamate both units. The senior surviving officer after 24 hours was a 17-year-old second lieutenant. All the other officers had been wounded or killed during the operation. And on loan to us from the National Army Museum is the wheel and light, which were presented to the Royal Munster Fusiliers after the war. And then went into the collections of the National Army Museum, and they've kindly lent them to us for the last 8 years. I think they'll be going home this year. But it's a very important memento of that occasion to have on display in our museum in Dublin. And recently was nominated as one of the History of Ireland in 100 Objects, was nominated as object number 96, as a very poignant memory of the Irishmen who fought in World War I. Another doctor, we seem to have a lot of doctors in our storyline in the National Museum of Ireland. Andrew Horn was a Roman Catholic doctor from Dublin, His two daughters are now in their 90s, and they came to visit me last year, and they presented to us his photographic album. Again, we seem to have been very lucky recently with getting photographic albums from donors. But Andrew, because he was in the back, the rear lines towards the beaches on, I think, W Beach, took amazing photographs, as you can see, some of the explosions occurring. And also, we've colorized again some of the photographs just to kind of give you an idea of what the beach on W Beach would have looked like from his first aid post. And he was one of the last officers to actually be left. He took photographs of the British and Turkish lines, and you can see how barren the land is and how close that the two lines were. And here you can see he was one of the last officers to be taken off from Gallipoli. And these are the last 5 officers who leave on the 11th of January 1916. So it's an amazing resource that we have in our collections. It also turns out that Major Egon was his commanding officer, which we only found out quite recently. So Major Egon had been captured and been sent out to Gallipoli, is put in charge of the young lieutenant. I'm not sure if they got on with each other, but we'll never know. So the second landings then, which are represented in Mel Gibson's film on Gallipoli as one of the great disasters, the landings at Suvla Bay. The 10th Irish Division go in on the 6th and 7th of August. And this is how the division was broken down. Again, it's one of those, a second disaster, if you like. The first landings were terrible on the 25th of April, but the ones on the 6th and 7th were equally as bad. Naturally, the Irish story has been largely forgotten at home, but it's also been kind of overshadowed by the Australians, who we all know fought in Gallipoli on their own and did all the fighting, while the Irish and the British officers drank tea on the beaches, apparently. I did Australian history in college, I can say that. And this, one thing that we do have and know about the guys, the soldiers who went to Gallipoli, is that they served in our barracks. This is where I work today. It's a former military barracks called the Royal Barracks. It consists of a cavalry and infantry barracks. This is the infantry side, and we've turned it into the National Museum of Ireland since 1997 and have a very large military exhibition there. But in 1915, 100 years ago, the 7th Battalion were based in this barracks, just short of 1,000 men from Dublin. D Company was a PALS company. It was made up of rugby players. And again, coming from the better parts of town, it's a very well documented. We have a lot of their letters. They also published a book in 1916 of their experiences called The Pals at Suvla Bay. And this is kind of a disparity that you see in remembering World War I. Sometimes it's very hard to find soldiers' stories, working class of Dublin, while of course the PALS unit, which was very well documented in the newspapers at the time and in letters, their story 100 years later is quite easy to understand. They were created or brought together by Mr. F.H. Browning, who was in charge of the IRFU at the time, the Irish Rugby Football Union. And he encouraged all rugby players in Dublin to join up. And this is them at Lansdowne Road, which is now known as the Aviva Stadium, where we will be playing England in a few weeks' time. It should be interesting to see what happens. What's interesting from a point of history is that Browning is later on killed during the 1916 Rising. He's one of the first officers to be killed. He's too old to go off to fight in Gallipoli, but he joins up in the reserve, the volunteers, and is out for a weekend exercise, marching back to his exercise, or to his barracks at Beggar's Bush when he's killed in an ambush at Mount Street. So again, because Dublin is quite small, you see the stories continuously happening, and I'll talk about that later on. In the book, Pals of Suvla Bay, every soldier is photographed, and we have a little pen picture of what happened to them in 1914, 15, and 16. It does mean that we have a huge amount of material just about the PALS and D Company. This is them again. We photographed or colorized some of the photographs. This is the PALS marching from Lansdowne Road to go up to the Royal Barracks to join up en masse. They're being left by 2 full-time soldiers, Regimental Sergeant Major Guest, who's from Tipperary, from a small town called Clough-Jordan, would survive the war, be awarded for his bravery, and also become an officer before retiring and join the Irish Civil Service in the 1920s. And then a John Hassett, who's the quartermaster. And these 2 men would spend a huge amount of time with the PALS, training them and trying to turn them from young gentlemen into fighting soldiers. On the last day before they left the barracks, they took photographs of themselves leaving the barracks. So we have this amazing collection called the England Collection of photographs of all the officers. The gentleman in the middle is the colonel in charge of the 7th Battalion, Dowling, Colonel Dowling. But we have this amazing collection of all the various photographs of them on the square where the museum is now today, before they march out. They all thought they were going to France. They left on the 30th of April. They thought they were going to France, and it came as a great surprise to them that they ended up in Gallipoli. Again, because of the secrecy and the climate of secrecy at the time, no information was only given to the senior officers. In many cases, they didn't even know when they were going to Gallipoli where they were going to exactly land. And the great descriptions of the battles that they fought. The first battle that they fought was called Chocolate Hill. But within a week of arriving, 131 of them were killed out of 230. Again, they landed, very little training. The training that they had received in the barracks was very much marching, route marches. And when it came to fighting, coming off boats, very little training for them. And of course, the British Army changes this in 1916 and 17, where more and more training is based on recreate and rebuild trenches. At this time, you're really seeing Kitchenger's army going off with very, very limited training. And the casualty rates are about 3,411. Again, we'll have these arguments about exactly how many died. And that's comparable to New Zealanders. So I think the Australians lost just about 7,000 or 8,000. And 75% of the 10th Division is killed or injured. When it comes to casualties, more casualties are coming from actually heat exhaustion, lack of water and dysentery. Which are the great killers or knockouts for them to become casualties. And again, water conservation or having enough water for the troops when they were on landing wasn't even thought about before they got off those ships. So what you read in all their letters within 3 or 4 days is every account, every description that they talk about is water. That's all that's on their minds, which is quite horrific. So that happens in 1915. Gallipoli is evacuated in January. In many ways, Dublin had come to, in a kind of 6-month period, mourn what had happened to the 6th and 7th Battalions, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and to the 10th Division. And Dublin and the rising of 1916 comes as a huge shock, not just to Dublin Castle, but also to the population in Dublin. This is a drawing of Dublin from one of the newspapers at the time, just kind of showing you the River Liffey in the centre of the city, and then the various buildings that the rebels had taken over, and the fires that take hold on our main street, which is O'Connell Street, or was known at the time Sackville Street. To give you a more colourful one interpretation, the blue areas are where the volunteers were holed up, taking over a series of buildings. And then Dublin has 9 military barracks in it, of which 2 are still occupied and used by the Irish Defence Forces. So in 1916 there was a large collection of barracks. So in many ways the British authorities just surrounded the city very, very quickly, and within 4 days the rebellion was over and was a complete disaster. Much of the local population, especially in and around what we call postal districts, Dublin 1, Dublin 8, which were the poor parts of Dublin, were in great opposition to the rebels, because their sons and their husbands, of course, were many of the working class soldiers who were out fighting in Gallipoli. And you do see conflict between both sides. The immediate response from the British Army is to send in the Irish battalions. So it's the Irish regiments that respond. In this case, Richard Burke is a young officer who's just joined up from a bank job where he was a bank clerk. And he joins up in the Royal Irish Regiment, who recruit in Waterford, Wexford and Kilkenny. And we have his uniform on display at the museum. And he's just here. This is Richard here, with the captured flag, rebel flag called the Irish Republic flag, which we also have now got on display at our museum. And for many years, this photograph is described as British Army officers with captured rebel flag. They're actually all Irish, and they're all from the Royal Irish Regiment. In many ways, the 1916 Rising is a small mini civil war, Irishmen fighting Irishmen. In relation to the 10th Battalion are based in the barracks that I'm in today, the Royal Barracks, where our museum is. We have a collection from a family who gave this to us, reading from Sergeant Watson, who joined up. He was an engineer in the railways, joined up into an Irish regiment. They advertised themselves very much as a PALS unit. Again, the 10th commercials, looking for people from middle-class jobs, and then advertising themselves as having a billiard room and a reading and smoking room. And not really focusing on the horrors of World War I, more on the social aspects of joining up into an army. They leave the barracks, which is just around the corner here, and are ambushed at Mendicity Institute, which is an institute just across the water. So the shooting is starting on this side, and then large numbers of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers are just killed here beside this shop, including Gerald Nealon. Gerald came from a very famous nationalist family, had served in the South African War, had then rejoined the British Army. And he is the first officer to be killed during this ambush. The irony of Irish history is his brother is just around the corner, about 500 metres, fighting with the rebels, Arthur Nealon, and he survives the 1916 Rising. So it's not just a small civil war, you are actually seeing brother against brother in this. People who followed Redmond into the mud on Fusiliers, thinking this is the right thing to do for Irish nationalism, and those who have kind of decided to the only way forward is revolution. And as I say, it's very much brother against brother. The immediate impact of the Rising, and this is a dramatic picture done in the 1930s of the last days of the leaders, and this will be the collection of leaders here in the General Post Office, which is clearly, as you can see, heavily on fire by Thursday of the week. But the real impact of it is the executions afterwards. 90 rebels are sentenced by court-martial, field court-martial to death, and 15 executions are carried out. And it's the impact of those executions that changes Irish history. When I talk to American students, they can't understand how just a simple incident like this could change, where the majority of society are quite keen to be or accept being part of the British Empire, to suddenly, by June 1916, a complete and utter political change, which leads actually to the eventual destruction of the main Nationalist Party to be replaced by Sinn Féin. The war carries on, though. The 16th Division, led by this gentleman here, General William Hickey, goes to war in September 1914. The 36th Division, of course, famously are involved on the first day of the Somme, do very, very well for the first couple of hours. They left their trenches early. They succeeded getting as far as the third line of German trenches. And when they came back, they presented this helmet to the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin as a war trophy, along with other items. Sadly for them, the divisions on either side of them didn't get as far as they did. So by lunchtime, the Germans along the front line were now able to focus on the 36th, and 5,500 of them are killed or made casualties in a 12-hour period. But very much an incident is very much remembered in Belfast even today. And this just gives you the short area around the Somme, where the Irish are fighting in that kind of period from July right up to November. On the 1st of July, the 36th Division are up around here, Thiepval, and Ginchy and Guillemont are where the 16th Division fight later on in September. When you break down what happens to the 36th and the 16th Division, they're involved in nearly every major battle right up into 1918. The casualty rates are very, very high. But as the war carries on, especially for the 16th Division, there's less and less Irish joining up. So the units acquire more and more Englishmen joining up. So the whole cohesiveness, if you like, or the Irishness of the division becomes less and less. And the 36th Division also suffers in many ways during the period. As I said earlier on, the story now is being expanded in Ireland. We're looking at how Irishmen served in other countries. Recent research now shows that 6,600 Irish-born men served with the Australian Army. And like the Irish volunteers in Australia, conscription was never introduced, although there was two referendums about it. But these, and I'll show you later on a website that's been established that actually lists all these Irish-born men. But if you look at second, third generation Irish in Australia, of course, your numbers again would increase a lot higher. In the Canadian Army, it's estimated, and there's no PhD research yet to do this, but there's research being carried out at the moment, that 20,000 Irish-born men served in the Canadian Army. Here we have a bust of a particular Irish soldier from Dublin called Private Lawless. His body was recovered 10 years ago by the Canadian Army at Vimy Ridge, and after doing exhaustive DNA testing, they actually found out who he was, and they were able to contact his family, including his surviving niece, who was at the ceremony to have him reburied. And a Canadian sculptor has forensically recreated Private Lawless, and we now have his bust on display in the museum. And particularly the Canadians are spending a huge amount of effort trying to kind of find, when they do find the bodies, to try and match up the bodies. So it's through DNA testing and other scientific testing, they eventually found out through his teeth that he, on the age of 10, had drunk water in the North County Dublin. It was actually through the teeth that they were able to do the chemistry test. I don't know how that happened, but they tell me, the experts, that that's how they did it. And because of where the water was coming from, only certain parts of the world where this water is. And when you're growing up as a kid, apparently that is layered through your teeth, and it's one way of finding out where you came from. As I said later on, the Irish join up in large numbers in the American Army. The 69th Fighting Irish are a very famous regiment. They fought in the American Civil War. General Lee described them as the Fighting Irish, and that's how they had the nickname, that the Fighting Irish. They went on and joined the 42nd Rainbow Division. The Rainbow Division was the Rainbow of America, represented every single state of America, and it was known as the Rainbow Division at the time, 42nd or 42 states. Sadly for the Irish, the Americans decided to come to Europe, not listen to the French or the British generals, and recreated all the horrors of what had been seen before in the Somme. So the casualty rates for the Irish are quite large. For the regiment, they lost 644 men, and they were only fighting from February to November. Again, the Americans, especially Pershing, insisted on frontal assaults, and then 2,500 of them are wounded. And it returned to America in April 1919. The regiment itself is still there today, mainly third and fourth generation Irish Americans, has just returned from Afghanistan, and 10 years ago served in Iraq, where it had the dubious distinction of having the highest casualty rates for any National Guard unit in 2005. And then just to expand our storyline, there were Irishmen on the other side. The Casement Brigade was an attempt by Roger Casement, the diplomat who had now fully become a nationalist, to convince Irishmen in the British Army and the prisoner of war camps to join up into a Casement Brigade. It never numbered more than about 54 men, but they had distinctive Casement Brigade uniforms where you can see an Irish harp and shamrocks are cut into the sleeves. So the idea was that this brigade would come back to Ireland and free Ireland at some stage. But I say the numbers were never there at 54, and most POWs were just content. They'd already signed a piece of paper, they'd already made a commitment, and they were happy to stay where they were. And going back even further, Ireland has a very long tradition of serving with the Austrian forces in the 17th and 18th centuries, and this tradition carried on into the 19th or the 20th century. Gottfried von Bamfield is the highest scoring fighter ace of the Austrian Air Force with 22 confirmed kills. He was also awarded the last person to receive the award of Marie Theresa, which is equivalent to the Victoria Cross in Austria before, of course, Austria surrendered in 1918. He was the Red Baron for the Austrian forces, lived on until 1986, and still revered in Austria because he was very much against the Nazis when they invaded in 1938. He eventually went to Italy, but refused to have anything to do with the Nazis, and that's very much why he was remembered in the 60s, 70s and 80s. So just coming into the last 5 minutes, commemorating World War I in Ireland. As Amy was saying earlier on, we 10 years ago did a very major exhibition called Soldiers and Chiefs, which is essentially a wing of the museum. It covers 2,000 square metres where we look at the complicated parts of our history, which is always fun to do because everyone in Ireland has a strong opinion on history. The first section looks at the wars and the history of the barracks and the wars that were fought from the 9 Years' War to the 1798 Rebellion. But the main core of the exhibition is looking at the Irishmen who served in the 18th and 19th century with the French, Spanish, Austrian, American and the British Army. And that's a large chunk of the exhibition. And then in the modern section we look at the decade of commemoration, looking at 1914 to 24 as you zigzag your way and aim very much at school groups to understand the complicated parts of our history. And then the final section looks at the Irish Defence Forces in the 20th century with the larger objects, the Big Boys Toys Gallery as it's called. And also very much we talk about the Irish in the British Army in World War II, in particular on the Irish Brigade, the 38th Brigade who fought in North Africa and the whole way up through Italy, the kind of unsexy end of the war of World War II. And then this year we've just launched a new exhibition, but we've also launched this project here, and there's some flyers that you'll see at the front, called The Pals, the Irish at Gallipoli. Looking at the records of the D Company and all the records that we had, we've working with a theatre company called New Productions, and we've recreated a World War I billet in our museum. And 4 actors basically bring the story of these soldiers, these Dublin men, and what actually happened to them, the training that received in the barracks, and then what happens to them when they go to Gallipoli, which, as I said earlier on, with the high casualty rates, is quite horrific. It's running 5 times a day. It's an hour-long show, so it's a very intensive experience. And the actors never break character. You do feel that you're back there in 1915 in the rooms that these men would have trained in. And you can see them from the optimism of leaving on the 30th of April 1915 to actually what happens to them on the 6th, 7th, 8th and 12th of August. And as I said, it's quite a harrowing experience. And that's going to be on 3 months, just for 3 months that the Royal Dublin Fusiliers were in the barracks. So February, March and April. And then on the 30th of April, we're going to recreate the march out as they march out of the barracks down onto the quays and to the down onto the boats down in Dublin Port. And these are the actors, and you can find more details in the flyers. If you have a chance to come to Dublin, please do. We need your tourist money. I'm contracted to say that. We've also established a new exhibition which kind of delves more into World War I. Recovered Voices, Stories of the Irish at War, 1914 to 15. We focus on the Irish regiments and in particular the history of the Royal Barracks. That's the tie-in that we have then with the actors. We focus on 21 individuals, many of them you've seen through this talk. And we also look at that expanded story. It's not just the Irish and the British Army, there are other armies that the Irish are fighting in, and we talk about that. And this way these galleries look. Lusitania, of course, is a key date that's coming up in May. And then the tie-in with this club, recently we've just put on display a memorial, World War I memorial that we received from the Hibernia United Services Club, which was founded in 1830 in the barracks that I work in, the Royal Barracks, and was a partner member to this club. It consisted of soldiers or officers of the British Army serving in Dublin. It was their home from home, if you like. It closed down in 2009. It's amalgamated now with a club next door. And the World War I memorial was decided to donate to us. And this is the memorial that was put up in 1920. So there's a link between this club, our museum, and the society. And then just when you're looking at researching World War I in Ireland, it's become a boom for researchers. There's a large number of associations. I know some of them are in the audience, but you have the Royal Munster Fusiliers, Dublin Fusiliers associations. In the 1990s, a lot of these groups were organised. They were people interested in learning about World War I, and mainly tied in with their family history and looking at what happened to the particular regiments. And they, again, have become very, very popular, but they're also for school groups and people like that, really a one-stop shop for them if they want to know anything about a particular group. I'd also recommend the Irish War Memorials site, which is a site that's gone around and listed and photographed every World War I memorial in Ireland. And you can find all the details. So they've gone to the Roman Catholic churches, but also the Church of Ireland and Presbyterian churches to find all the details that you want about listing World War I dead. And then, of course, you would know all about the British Army Service Records, but the Irish Anzacs project is being run from the museum or university in Australia, and that lists the over 6,000 Irish-born enlistments. Again, unlike the records in Kew, which have been largely destroyed, in Canada and in Australia, all the records still exist. They've all been scanned and are free and accessible on the government websites there. Sadly, as you know, in Kew, you have to pay quite a large chunk of cash to get very basic information. And then books about World War I in the 1980s, Orange, Green and Khaki, which is a very definitive military history of all the Irish regiments, what happened to them. If you're looking for kind of a summary of Ireland and the Great War and the complexities of it all, how it was remembered from 1920s right up to the present day, Professor Keith Jeffrey from Queen's University Belfast wrote a definitive book in 2000. And more recently this year and last year, of course, there's been a boom of other books being published, this one by Stephen Stanford, which is on the 10th Division, which looks at the complexities of recruitment in Ireland and has some very fascinating and exciting new research. That's my contact details. If anyone's coming to Dublin, please do come. As I said, we need your tourist money. But I'll happily give you a tour of the exhibitions and the museums. And if you can come before April, as I say, flyers are here about the PALS project, which I say is very, very exciting and getting rave reviews in all of the theatre reviewers in Dublin at the moment and getting booked out very, very quickly. So that's it. So thank you very much, folks.